Okay, I think that we have resolved the issue. This is WZRD Chicago 88.3 FM. And we have with us at WZRD Catharine Carr. She is the author of World Soul. Welcome to WZRD, Catherine. How are you? And would you like to tell us your real name? We know that your pen name is Catherine Carr.
Thank you. Yes, it's great to be here. And my legal name is Claire. I write under the pen name Catharine Carr because I actually write in a couple of different genres. And you don't want people thinking they're buying like a science fiction book and then getting a theology book instead. So for my religious writing, I'm like, let's make those very clearly identifiable. But yeah, I'm glad to be here and to talk about. I've been doing much more of the religious and spiritual work in the last few years than the fiction, so it's really good to be here and to get to talk about some ideas that I wish I had known when I was younger.
What inspired you to write about paganism? Was there not enough information out there about this subject?
So it's interesting. I was just having a conversation with some pagan priests this week where we were talking about the fact that in paganism, pagans tend to be very practical. They tend to be very, here is how you do this ritual, and here is what my personal experience has been. There's less of the systematic theology where people are academically thinking out, well, what are the implications for these beliefs? And I come from a Catholic background, so the Catholics are very big on the theological logic of, well, if we believe that X is true, then what are those implications for how we live our lives? And how do we reconcile this with maybe other religions' beliefs and experiences? So that's something that is a real passion of mine, talking in a more systematic way about what do pagans believe theologically, and how is that different from Christianity and Islam, which a lot of people think of as all religion. I know so many people who think that, those two belief families are all the religion that there is in the modern world, which is very not accurate. So.
Let's first of all discuss a little bit about your background so that we can establish with our listeners your authority on paganism.
Yeah, definitely. So as I mentioned, I come from a Catholic background. Um, there's some possibility that if I'd been a guy, I might have been a Catholic seminarian, but they do not believe that women can be priests in their tradition. And as I got older, I really started to notice that there were some conflicts between my conscience and the Christian teachings as they were being enacted today. And obviously, not all Christian denominations agree on those teachings, but there were certain things that I was being told by a lot of different sources. If you're a Christian, you have to believe X, Y, and Z. And I was like, that doesn't sit right with me. So then I find out there are these people called pagans who have very similar beliefs and religious experiences to mine. And there were a lot of books about the pagan experience, but it is also a very oral tradition, paganism is. So there are a lot of, like, I have read surprisingly few pagan books in the course of my pagan journey. It's much more often, oh, if you want to know about this, talk to this person, or I learned this at a physical circle, learning from this teacher. So in World Soul, some of it is things that I've learned through oral tradition that are not necessarily in the books as often. And I just really felt like I wanted to bridge that gap because there are so many people who, don't have the ability to be in some of these circles. A lot of pagan teachers, unfortunately, also keep a low profile because pagans still get a lot of harassment in some places. So I'm really trying to bring the best of what I've learned and also the best of what I've read so that you don't have to read, six different books to get a basic overview of what makes pagan theology different from Abrahamic theology and specifically from Christian and Muslim theology.
Also, the Bible and the Quran are religious texts that people could refer to for religious thought and theology. What about paganism? I know that you're both, you want to bring it to the public so that they understand it better. But is there any definitive text that at least a more definitive text about paganism that people have always referred to?
So that's an excellent question, because that's one thing that does make pagans different from a lot of world religions. Paganism really is an umbrella term for just tens of thousands of different traditions. In World Soul, we focus on the things that those traditions tend to have in common. Things like believing that there can be multiple divine entities that are good to, pray to and have relationships with, giving central importance to the natural world as being literally the work of divine hands. Humans didn't make it, so that doesn't leave a lot of options. And those are things that many pagan theologies around the world have in common. But there is no one source text of paganism because it is such a diverse, literally from the ground up. Like people who live in relationship with nature develop certain worldviews, and that is what we refer to today as paganism. And some pagan traditions actually have specific rules against writing down some of their teachings because
And
the Hmm?
why those rules? What is the
Yeah.
rationale for making that rule?
So the when I first came to paganism, I didn't understand it, but in the years I've been in it, I really kind of do because the idea is that you want people to be interfacing with the reality directly. You want people to be interfacing with the natural world directly, with the gods directly, and if they have a sacred text, we've seen the kind of issues that can lead to in religions that do have those, where people focus very intensely on the words in the text and don't necessarily agree about what those words mean and can get very caught up in the text. So I do actually see the logic of keeping this as a living, growing set of traditions that I do think we should write some things down to share them. But I really understand why someone would not want a written book to be your primary source of truth. There's a saying some druids have that the natural world is actually the sacred text of paganism. So, like, if you want to really study the source material, you study the natural world.
In other words, it's book learning versus street smarts, and the street smarts is actually delving into the natural world.
Yeah, yeah, that's a good analogy. It's how it says it is in the books is never going to fully match the reality of things. And in paganism, they really want you to engage with that reality.
When in your book you have a very interesting chapter about God, and that how God is masculine in the major religions, and that has caused a discrimination of women as a result because uh, it seems as if the male figure of God delegates the woman into like a subservient position. uh, how how does that when the pagans uh have that duality in success, and also for some of them having the goddess as a god, and having the goddess be the birth mother of all creation. Is that symbolic, or do pagans take that as literal, that all the living life is birthed from the goddess?
Yeah, that's another really great question. There's a saying among every Christian denomination I've ever worked with, you ask five Catholics, you'll get six answers. And that is even more true among pagans. So there are some pagans who I think take a more symbolic approach, and some that take a very literal approach. Like our bodies literally come from the earth, which many pagan traditions conceptualize as the creator goddess of Earth. The gender question is really interesting because if you talk to like the highest level theologians in Christianity and Islam, they will tell you that God is not literally male, and there are even a few passages in the Bible that compare God to women in different roles. But because the default way of talking about God in those books is masculine, and because, not everyone has a master's in theology, there are a lot of people who have taken it to mean that God is literally male. And like for the Catholics example, they believe that women can't perform certain spiritual operations because Jesus was a man, and therefore if you want to perform certain spiritual operations that he did, you have to also be a man. And that's the kind of thinking that can get very slippery. And it also has interesting implications for the relationship of God to creation. Because if you have God making creation as a tool, an inanimate tool that's made of this separate, inferior, inanimate substance, that has implications for God's relationship morally and emotionally to creation. Whereas if we view creation as, the child of God, born of her body, that is a very different relationship that it gives us.
When you speak about the women's place and uh, how could you explain to our real listeners about how women got discriminated against as a result of all of the centuries of male dominance and in the religious text. And also, since you did mention that in the Bible there are instances in which uh, God may be interpreted as a woman, would you happen to have the book and the chapter and verse so that our listeners could actually go into the Bible and study it to see how the Bible has written about women in as God.
Yeah, let me pull that up for you. So the discrimination is that's a very big question, right? Because it doesn't even only happen in religions that explicitly say God is male. There are other religions that don't say that still have patriarchal issues.
Mhm.
And in World Soul, one of the things I was glad to be able to do was bring a little bit of sociology and history in to say, like, here are some possible reasons why patriarchal imperialism developed in the last few millennia. And, it isn't the only reason that we have a lot of gender based violence in the world. That was one of the main concerns at the Parliament of World Religions when I was there this year. But it doesn't help when you have a lot of religious leaders saying that, God is male. Religious leaders have to be male, and women have this inherently subservient position. It doesn't help. So I'm going to, if you'll forgive me, I'm going to mute myself while I shuffle around in some papers and find these verses for you.
Sure.
Here we go. So, for those who are interested, there is a group called the Women's Ordination Conference, which is actually a Christian group that is interested in promoting the ordination of women as clergy in Christianity. And they have this great collection of Bible quotes that describes God as a woman, as a mother in different angles, and it's really interesting if you read their compilation here.
What is the website?
Um, so the website is womensordination.org. And under their resources, there is a female images of God in the Bible. And they have a list of several dozen verses that compare God to a mother specifically, talk about, God being a protective mother bear, about God having labor pains to give birth to the people. And those are a minority of the gender descriptions that God gets in the Bible, but there are quite a few of them in there, which is something that I think a lot of modern Christian religious leaders don't talk about very often.
Actually, I have never heard of that before. I have read the Bible before, and then this never came up until I read your book.
Well, I'm glad to be getting the word out there. It is interesting because one of the criticisms of my work that I actually get from some Christian and Muslim theologians is, what do you mean? Our books don't teach that God is literally a man. It's a linguistic artifact that, all of our nouns are gendered and God is usually gendered as male. But I'm like, yeah, but a lot of people think that your books do literally say that, like including a lot of your religious leaders think that your books literally say that. So you guys got to be doing more PR about that, because I know that at the root of it, the gender, and this is very interesting, the gender of the highest divinity in almost every world religion I've studied has had both male and female components, but that gets lost in translation a lot when you're translating to other languages.
Such as what religion are we talking about now?
So that is the case in both Christianity and Islam.
Mm.
There actually is the highest level of theology is that God encompasses all genders. If you look at, for example, Zoroastrianism, it's the same thing. The name of God in Zoroastrianism, Ahura Mazda, has both male and female components, and they are very careful to preserve that because they don't want this patriarchal thing to happen. But a lot gets lost in translation when you've got scriptures where 95% of the pronouns God is getting are male.
And they want to avoid the patriarchal connotation in Zoroastrianism. Do you know why do they want to avoid that patriarchy?
Yeah, yeah. So I think it seems to be pretty universally agreed for thousands of years now that patriarchy and putting some people in positions of power and status just based on their gender is not a great idea. It's something that Jesus talks about as well in the New Testament very explicitly. In Genesis, male and female, he created them. In the New Testament, there is neither male nor female, neither slave nor free, but all are children of God. So that's a message that a lot of the prophets and religious founders are actually very big on. But then their followers happen, and a lot of them are in patriarchal societies, so it is very easy for that part of the message to get lost and to focus more on, how men should be in charge of things. And there are some passages in the Old Testament of the Bible, for example, that do suggest that. But the Zoroastrians very specifically tried to avoid that and tried to avoid anything that could cause confusion on that point. So.
When you also spoke about the animals and inanimate living things being embraced by paganism. So, according to paganism, do animals and inanimate objects have souls?
Yeah, that is another really important difference between Christianity and Islam specifically, and the pagan religions, is that Christianity and Islam I will admit I don't know as much about this in Islam, but certainly in Christianity, humans tend to be given this very special, privileged place, almost like we're the only ones that matter, and everything else in the world is basically objects for our use. And that is very much not the case in the pagan religions, where, people who are living in community with nature know that, animals are beings that have consciousness and experience emotions and have their own lifestyles and agency and behaviors. And even plants, modern science is learning more and more, that plants actually communicate chemically and can send signals and receive signals and behave differently based on how you treat them. So in paganism, there is a much more egalitarian, like, all beings are children of the earth, all beings have spirits. They're not the same kinds of spirits, but there isn't this sense that, humanity is the main character and can do whatever humanity wants to other species without consequence. There's very much this, like, we're all in this together and we need to all respect each other regardless of species.
You explained and implied in World Soul that because of this stance on human beings being being the only ones that really matter, that affected how man has the human race has depleted the resources and just uh, plunder the earth of the resources and a lot of the animals and plants, driving them to extinction. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, definitely. Um, I learned some really interesting things while writing Worlds. So I did not know nearly as much about Judaism when I started writing it as I do now. But in Judaism, for example, there is actually a clause in the scripture that is, man is to have dominion over the earth for as long as humanity is a good steward. And that didn't quite make it over in the translation to the Christian texts. So there is this mindset among a lot of Christians that environmentalism is actually wrong because it is in some way, it's blasphemous to suggest that humans could bring about the end of the world because only God can do that. And I'm over here like, okay, but we can make things real bad without it technically being the apocalypse, guys. Um, and it is, unfortunately, I quote in World Soul a few prominent Christian religious leaders in the US who have said things like, oh, environmentalism is idolatry. It's, attributing too much spiritual importance to the earth and it's nature worship. And that's wrong because our God is the only true God. And that's really the kind of thing that I talk about in World Soul, is the problematic implications of some of these theological ideas. Like, if you're going to insist that your God is not incarnate in the material world and that the material world is inferior to your God, how are people then going to treat the material world? And that's where we see a lot of politicians, unfortunately, taking advantage of Christian belief to be like, oh, because these people want to save the environment, they're anti-Christian because they're, engaging in idolatry and earth worship and all these things. And that's not helpful right now, folks. I mean, it's January in Chicago, and we've had how many days below freezing this year? It's climate change is a real thing.
Or idolatry. Could you explain how the Bible, the Christians, ended up uh, saying that respecting animals is wrong, uh, and speak a bit about the God being a jealous God as well. God being a jealous God.
Yeah, that was a really surprising finding in my religious research has been that the only time I have been able to find a situation where a religion has one single deity and that deity says, I am jealous. You are not to worship any other deities. The only time that seems to have happened is with the Abrahamic faiths. And it's interesting because they will claim that other religions had similar beliefs. Like I was told when I was young that the Great Spirit in Native American theology was similar, that Inti Raymi of Incan theology was similar, that Ra of the Egyptians was similar. No, none of them were actually. None of those religions are really monotheistic, and there were some really interesting mistranslations that went into, I think, maybe some Christian missionaries trying to make them sound more similar to Christianity. But the reality is that religions generally, they might have a single source of all creation, even a single top deity, but that deity is not seen to either want to or have the moral authority to forbid the worship or interaction with other spirits. In a lot of other world religions, including the pagan ones, there are lots of ways of having relationships with different spirits that are considered holy and necessary, including, relationships with land and animal and plant spirits, relationships with ancestor spirits and different deities that have specific domains. And in the Abrahamic texts, a lot of that is banned. And that is the only time I have really seen that happen on the world religious stage. And there's even some debate as to the translation of those passages. Like, well, did they mean you're not supposed to talk to spirits at all, or you're not supposed to do this specific thing that this specific group was doing at the time this text was written? But the way it's translated generally today is that you're not supposed to talk to any spirits that are not specifically whitelisted by your religious leader. And that includes plant spirits, animal spirits, land spirits. So it's very restrictive, and I think that's why a lot of people are looking into paganism today, because people will have these religious and spiritual experiences, and then there's no place for them in these congregations that say, okay, but these things don't have spirits, or if they do, you're not supposed to talk to them. They might be demons. It's very interesting.
For the world's major religions, they seem to be more proselytizing in those religions. But does do paganists proselytize? Proselyte.
Yep. So pagans do what is called passive proselytization, which is like, we want to let you know that we exist and have the information available about what we do if you want to know about it. That's part of what I do with this book, but there is no commandment at all within paganism to go out and convert people. When you're coming from a polytheistic worldview, that's actually considered quite rude, because it's like, you could already have a god. We don't want to step on that god's toes. So trying to convert people is not really a thing, but just like, hey, we exist. You can come learn more about us if you want, is more of the pagan thing generally.
So, in other words, in paganism, there's no threat hanging over an unbeliever's head, as if they do not convert, then they will be doomed. There is none of that in paganism.
Exactly. Different pagan traditions do have different procedures about what you're supposed to do to get, the good afterlife. But a lot of them teach that it can actually be different for different groups of people, because this is our way of doing it. It's not, necessarily the only right way of doing it. And a lot of it also just comes down to like following basic moral rules that are pretty universal across cultures. Like maybe don't murder people unless you're in the context of war, which that's a whole discussion.
When you talk about world soul, what are you talking about?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So the term world soul comes from the fact that a lot of world religions, not just those that would necessarily self-identify as pagan, but a lot of world religions that do give divine origin to the material world have this concept of a world soul, which is like sometimes referred to as God by some of the theologians of those religions, or like a universal consciousness from which all things originate and which, because of this, all things are divine in origin and sacred. And this is a concept that came up in several of the religions I studied while working on World Soul, and I thought it was a very good kind of title to start with, because so much of this book is about more things being divine, and specifically about the natural and material world being divine, when some of the religions out there might teach that that's not the case. So that's a major point for me.
How does paganism line up with science? Like you said, if everybody is part of that world soul, and physics teaches that everything is electricity, so we're actually a part of one another and a part of the entire universe. So how does paganism line up with modern science, the just sci physics and scientific concepts?
Yeah, so if you look into modern physics, folks, things get so weird so fast. And there's a lot of things happening with like quantum uncertainty and matter energy conversions that a lot of people have made specific theological claims about. And I'm like, on one hand, I agree with the physicists who say, hey, don't assume that this confirms a theological worldview. We haven't really proven that. But I'm also kind of like, but you haven't disproven it either, have you? Um, so I won't speak too much to the physics because that is all just so profoundly weird. Seriously look into it, the observer effect, quantum entanglement, interesting stuff. But in the more well understood areas of science, there have been a lot of points where paganism has been proven surprisingly right. You know, there are a lot of ideas about, for example, plants being able to perceive and communicate, about how ecosystems work and how you need to keep balance in ecosystems, or even within the human body, how the mind can really affect the physical health, which in the last few decades, scientists have found all of these chemical messengers for, like, oh gosh, yeah, we have a chemical mechanism by which we can prove that all this communication and kind of holistic relationship does happen. That used to be considered very superstitious.
Mhm.
And now it's like, as science advances, we are seeing more and more ways in which, hey, the indigenous people really knew what they were talking about, including the pagan forefathers and foremothers. So yeah, it's coming out pretty well as far as scientific validation in a lot of ways.
Hmm. For let's see. Let's talk about slavery and subservience, and how that shows up in uh, the male-dominated religions versus paganism.
Yeah, so this is one where this is again a point where a lot of people have valid criticisms of modern pagans, where they're like, oh, you know, you're acting like your religion is so much more peaceful and enlightened than other modern religions, but historically, pagan societies did have slavery, did have some very unsavory practices. And modern pagans say to that, well, yes, but we're not, you know, living 3,000 years ago. So we're not trying to recreate the way things were 3,000 years ago any more than like a Christian might try to recreate the Christianity that existed at the time of the slave trade. And so there are, you know, there have been a lot of histories of pagan religions having slavery and having all sorts of human rights abuses. But the one thing I can say is that for a lot of pagan religions, it is harder to justify that using scripture. Like when I was a Christian, there were people who could find scriptures to say, oh, this says, we're allowed to have slaves and we're allowed to physically punish people and we're allowed to, men are allowed to be unconditionally in charge of women and children and like physically discipline them. In paganism, you can't really go to a text and say, oh, well, this says that I'm allowed or required to commit this human rights abuse. And the theology that is more explicitly egalitarian, I think, does help, that more explicitly talks about the divine origin of the individual and the individual's ability to connect to the divine. I think takes some of that power out of the hands of institutions to be able to say, oh, well, this person, can't be in charge of themselves because they're part of some group.
So when they when did you say earlier that pagans do, yeah, they do not proselytize, but they explain their position, and it's up to the listener to decide for himself or herself, right?
Yes,
Mhm.
yes. The polytheistic worldview, one of my opinions is that one of the benefits of it is that there are multiple legitimate ways to do things. So like we're going to tell you our opinion, but your God is as legitimate as ours and we don't want to like take you away from your God unless that's what you feel called to do.
And what is the purpose of proselyting? Is it that they want to have more donations or have more people obeying them? What is the purpose of that? And then versus, of course, the paganism, which just presents the views, right? They do not try to convince people to join.
Yeah, so this is a good opportunity to talk about imperial religions,
Mm,
which this thing does often happen where the religious power structure becomes used for a political or economic goal. And if you look at the ancient pagan empires, for example, they were very interesting because they were polytheistic, so they would say, like, you have to pay tribute to this official god of the state, but because we're polytheistic, you can also, pretty much keep doing what you were doing religiously because your gods and our gods can exist at the same time. So we don't have to eliminate your gods in order to feel that you are, paying proper homage to the state religion. In Christianity, one thing that really threw a lot of pagans during the early conversion was that, Christians would come and say, hey, we got this God, he's Jesus, he's great. And people would be like, hey, yeah, Jesus does sound really great. And then they would put him on their pantheon. And the missionaries would come back and be like, no, you don't understand. You need to get rid of all the other gods on this pantheon if you want to work with Jesus. And they would be like, why? So that's, fun fact, actually the origin of, in the Catholic Church, you have to study for a year before you can officially commit to being baptized as an adult. And one of the reasons for that was that the Catholic missionaries started going, man, we need people to be really clear on the fact that they can't still be worshiping their other gods if they're going to be Catholic. So that's a little bit of a digression,
no.
but it does speak to how a lot of the time proselytizing for a religion can be a matter of getting more money, more power over people's mundane lives, but also how the polytheistic religions do that differently and don't demand maybe quite as much conformity, even when they are doing the imperial thing, as a monotheistic religion that's going to say, like, no, like every custom and every spirit of your religion has to go because they can't coexist with ours.
For paganism, most of them are polytheistic, or are all of them polytheistic?
So this gets into one of the most interesting questions in historical religious studies, which is how does one define a god? The Abrahamic sense of that usually is the same as like the source of all creation. Like God is that which creates all things, but also is this individual that you can pray to and have this very personal relationship with. Among the pagan religions, a god, there are a lot of gods, and so obviously they aren't all the single source of all creation, but they are spirits that are, my personal definition of a god is anything that is worshipped, because in paganism you run into these interesting things like, is a plant spirit or animal spirit? Is that a god? Is a land spirit a god? At what point does it become a god? So there are a lot of spirits that you can interact with, and some of them are clearly recognized as gods, and others it's like, is that qualified as a god? Because people do, worship it and offer it and have relationships to it. Um, but yeah, so there's a different approach to what that word means, and having multiple gods. There are pagan theologians who say that you need multiple beings to encompass all of infinite creation, so you can't actually encompass infinity with just one deity that you can have a personal relationship with, if that makes sense.
Mhm. And for paganism, I think I understand why the major religions uh, require people to worship a god. In paganism, is it enough to be a good person, or is it necessary to worship some of these other spirits, other deities?
So this is something that, you ask five pagans, you get six different answers, but there really isn't the same emphasis on requiring worship that there is in say Christianity or Islam. There is a sense of reciprocal relationship between humans and gods where it's like, if you want help and support with a specific thing, maybe it's a good idea to have a specific relationship with this god. But to my knowledge, in the pagan traditions, your, moral character and afterlife destination is not primarily determined by whether you worship the gods. And that again is an effect of polytheism, because then it's like, well, which god? Because there's a bunch of gods, so to say that you have to worship one particular god to get the good afterlife is undermining the other gods. And there are non theistic pagans, there are modern pagans who only work with nature spirits and energies and don't work with deities. There are modern pagans who actually identify as atheopagans, who are like, I do not literally believe in the existence of gods separate from the human mind, but I believe that the myths and practices of paganism are beneficial to humans. And then there are theistic pagans, a couple different flavors of those. So there really is a diversity, and because of the polytheism, the worship of any one god is considered much less essential, I think.
For paganism, was it ever in the past male dominated? Did some did some of the I see that you say that there are a lot of different pagan traditions, but were there
Yeah.
any pagan traditions that were male dominated?
There definitely have been. One example I give in World Soul is the Greek and Roman pagans were varying degrees of patriarchal.
Mhm.
And so that is definitely something that can happen. But that's actually really interesting, because when you look at it, there's like this internal conflict within their myths. Um, where there are gods who are acting very patriarchal and being like, yeah, men should be in charge of things, but there are also conversations that happen where it's very clear that the goddesses on the pantheon have a lot of power. There's one particular conversation in a Greek play, I believe, where Zeus is saying something along the lines of, oh, Aphrodite doesn't belong on the battlefield, don't be silly. But analysts have been like, the fact that Zeus is saying that makes it sound like it was a debate, like there wasn't agreement on that. And Aphrodite, indeed, in her older forms, did have military aspects.
Hmm.
So there's definitely been a lot of patriarchy, but there's also been a lot of more egalitarian sentiment that again is possible because of polytheism, because you have deities of all the genders advocating for themselves and their people.
Were the patriarchal paganists what how did they uh, end that patriarchal band, or have
Yeah,
they
well,
not?
that's a really good question, actually. I'm glad you asked that because one thing I do maybe neglect in my talks because I don't interact with them very much is that there are aggressively patriarchal pagans still around today. Some of the famous examples that are given is that unfortunately um, there are a lot of groups that are white supremacist heathens. There are also a lot of groups that are not, and far more groups that are actively anti-racist, as far as I know. But in my experience, race supremacy almost always goes along with patriarchy. Don't know why that is. There's an evolutionary psych experiment for you. But so those heathens, for example, do tend to be aggressively patriarchal, and there have been a lot of, I'm trying to think how to put this diplomatically, a lot of disagreement between different heathen groups, some of which identify as openly racist and sexist, and others of which are like, that is not only not cool, but not in agreement with the scriptures that we do have from pre-Christian Europe, which is a whole thing. White supremacist heathenry is very stupid, not just because racism is stupid, but because, like, if I were to read the base scriptures of heathenry, what I would take away from it about interracial marriage, for example, would be that it's great. Like, it's great, then you get the strengths of different peoples in the same family, and it's just fantastic. So, there are patriarchal pagans and unfortunately racist pagans, but they are generally in the minority, and most people don't think that they are the most in accordance with their own source texts.
And you mentioned that the major religions have that but that thought about slavery and subservience among the worshippers, among the followers. Um, do paganists, any paganists also embrace that view?
So, are you referring to the point where I talk about there are Christian Muslim theologians who have been known to refer to like all humans as basically being like slaves and property of God? Is that what you're referring
Yes,
to?
yes,
Okay.
exactly.
Yeah, that is a very troubling view that I have run into from an unfortunate number of Christians and Muslims that essentially, and this actually goes back to the question of God's gender and mode of creation, because their view is okay, God, so we are clay in the hands of the potter, right? Therefore, we are tools that God made to serve his purposes. Therefore, God has the moral right to treat humans any way that he wants, and we don't have the moral right to complain about it because we are his property. And you get this a lot in the more violent and punitive strains of Christianity and Islam, where people are like, well, I mean, you can object to the fact that in our religious worldview, most people are going to hell, but you don't have the moral right to do so because God made us, so God can do whatever he wants with us. And also, what goes along with that is that we owe God absolute obedience, and like disobeying God's will is the worst thing you can possibly do, which is a common sentiment in certain strains of Christianity and Islam. And in my view, I'm like, I mean, I feel like God can take care of his own will. Like I don't feel like he needs religious leaders to constantly lecture people about doing what God says because he's God or she's God. I don't feel like they're that threatened by us. But that is unfortunately a common view that you see in some strains of Christianity and Islam.
And so paganism, do any so some paganists too, do they subscribe to that slavery and subservient view? Are do some do men, do humans have to worship and have to accept that they are subservient, the human race is subservient?
You know, I haven't encountered that same kind of attitude in pagan circles so far. I'm sure somebody who believes that exists because there are pagans are an especially diverse group where there's not really a governing body that tells you the right way or the wrong way to believe. So I'm sure someone believes that, but generally there is a view that if humans want certain kinds of boons from the gods, they need to give the gods a certain kind of respect and feedback to them, but there's definitely less of a like, oh, by virtue of you existing you owe obedience to this specific god. That is not really a thing that I've seen.
What about angels? You mentioned in your book that there are some beings that might actually be angels that are referred to in the sacred text.
Yeah, so that is a really interesting topic for conversation because angels are interpreted differently by different Abrahamic groups as far as what they are and what they're capable of. And in some of those interpretations, they sound a lot like pagan gods. In some of them, they are very definitely not, because in the Catholic interpretation, for example, angels don't have certain kinds of agency that gods have. I believe there are some Jewish interpretations where that's true as well. But there are other interpretations where it's like, if you took this interpretation and that interpretation, these are actually very similar beings. So that's a very interesting one. There are also a lot of pagans who believe in both gods and angels independently. Does an angel become a god if you worship it? I don't know. But there are a lot of pagans as well who will actually work with both gods and angels as different classes of spirits.
And for paganists, are they very structured or are they more open to not their followers, not having to follow all the rituals? Uh, how 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 important is ritual for paganism? Paganists?
We are the least structured people, almost to a fault. There's actually debates within paganism about whether paganism is structured enough to be considered a religion, and I'm like, well, we do have a theology and practices, and we want those First Amendment protections, but also, um, so there are, like I said, thousands of traditions of paganism, and each of them have their own ritual traditions. I will say that a lot of pagans are intensely practical in terms of talking about what is the purpose of rituals and when a ritual's needed and when can they be adapted. Like if you talk to the heathens, they talk about this a lot, where there are certain heathen rituals that historically have been as needed. It's not like there's a date on the calendar where you have this ritual. It's like when it becomes necessary, you have this ritual. So pagans do a lot of ritual. That is something that a lot of people actually like about it because there are benefits, even neurological benefits, to taking the time and space and setting a certain kind of scene and performing certain actions and speaking certain words. So there is a lot of ritual within paganism, but it's less of for example, the Catholic view that you have to do this ritual on this day or like you're a terrible pagan. There is definitely less of that.
Mhm. How do you reconcile the when you mentioned the angels being uh just talk a little bit more about how angels affect us and the other possibilities of who angels might actually be.
Yeah, that's a great question. So, one of the first things that happened when I became a pagan was that I had religious experiences with three different entities from three different pantheons, including one that was not theologically compatible with the others. So, I was being like, I don't know what's going on because none of these sets of rules I have been taught can be true if all of these things can exist together. I think that's one reason why pagans don't do as much formal theology, because we have enough religious experiences to be like, we're not going to try too hard to figure out how it all works because we're not going to be right. We're just not going to get the full story. But I do like to do that at a very basic level. And that is really a major distinguishing feature of pagan congregations in my experience, is that just very nearly everybody is having personal religious experiences. And we get a lot of people who have had religious experiences that didn't match the teachings of, for example, the church that the person was in at the time. And then they had to be like, okay, there's something more here that my church does not have room for. It looks like the pagans would be amenable to talking about that.
Mhm.
So there are, pagan theologians who consider angels to be a whole separate class of being, that, was created separately and has its own, things, its own duties and properties. There are also pagans who consider angels to be, maybe they're actually part of another class of spirit. Maybe they are, deities or something that were classified as angels by the Abrahamic faiths. I don't pretend to be an expert on angels, but the pagan religious view is very much that, if you are a spirit and you show up and you're not an evil spirit, because pagans have a lot of wards and protections and procedures for dealing with evil spirits. That's a whole other thing, because like, if you have a demon problem, there are two people you go to. You go to the Catholics or you go to the pagans, because they're both groups that have a lot of procedures for getting rid of evil spirits. Um,
How often have you seen them? And do those rituals get rid of the evil spirits?
so this again is something that I have less experience with. I do know that Catholic exorcists know what they're
Mhm.
doing. I have seen them in action several times. Um, and pagans, again, it's different traditions
Mhm.
have different ways of doing it. I have definitely seen some of those be very effective as well. I guess the risk with pagan rituals is that sometimes people can become a little blasé about them, because
Mhm.
among the Catholics, it's very specific. Like, there's very specific procedures that you have to do, and they're only triggered under very specific circumstances. And with pagans being less rigid, sometimes there is a risk of. I was just talking to someone the other night about someone who didn't ward a spiritual working that they were doing properly, and they did end up with an evil spirit problem.
Mhm.
And it's not that the pagan rituals can't do it, but that sometimes people don't fully use them because we're not as regimented, and there's not as much, in some ways, not as much of a fear element in paganism.
Mhm. And without that, the fear element, do you find that uh, the the paganists and their beliefs do not spread as far as the major religions? Is it that the major religions are more coercive and then they get a bigger following?
There is something to be said, I think, for the fact that the religions which kind of have the scariest version of hell and the most narrow interpretation of who doesn't go there are the biggest religions in the world today. I think there is something to be said, unfortunately, for fear as a motivator. And we see this when we look at the 24-hour news cycle, right? The reason a lot of reporting these days is very hyperbolic and sensationalist and doom and gloom is that that's what gets clicks.
Mhm.
People are evolutionarily wired to pay the most attention to what they think is going to kill them. So I do think there might be a relationship there, and that is something that I wish we as individuals could be more conscious of, because we don't get the best results when we only focus on the scariest thing. And so I feel like we as individuals really need to be mindful of that, whether it's in religion, in politics, in the news, not only responding to fear, and kind of having a more nuanced view of is this fear-based worldview really the worldview that's going to suit us best?
Mhm. When you mentioned that the fear factor, it seems as if it also encompasses what we talked about on as slavery and subservience. A lot of people when they even talk about their pets, they if they were to treat the pets as a slave or as a subservient life, that would be akin to abuse.
Yeah, and that's an excellent observation. There's been a shift that some people might have noticed away from referring to pet owners and toward referring to pet parents,
Hmm.
because people are increasingly like, "Oh, this is this being that I love and care for. Like I don't want to be referring to this being as my property." Um and that is an excellent point on the distinction between like a living being as an object that you own and a living being as a being that you have a relationship to.
How has the major religions changed? Has the rise of paganism affected the major religions at all?
So this is very interesting. In World Soul, I talk about how in the mid 20th century we saw this massive shift. I would almost suggest that in some ways it's the opposite, where in the mid 20th century there was this massive shift that had to do with the civil rights movement, that had to do with scientific rationalism, of people saying, "Hey, we don't necessarily feel that the position of these old school churches are about patriarchy, for example, about all of these other things are correct. We don't necessarily believe that they're moral authorities. So we're going to move and do our own thing." By far, the largest religious affiliation that has gained following in recent years has been, atheism, agnostic, no religion. A huge, huge proportion of people have stopped identifying with any religion, because, to some extent, of the ways in which the older religious institutions were complicit in human rights problems. With paganism, what I'm seeing happen is that a number of people who are like, well, I don't want to be with those religions anymore, and I don't have to be, because this isn't the 1950s where, there are going to be severe social consequences to not being a member of the church. And they're like, but I still believe in a higher power, but I still have religious experiences, but I still value a spiritual worldview. And then they are realizing that, oh, that's what the pagans are doing. And so I think the reason that paganism is growing very, very rapidly, I believe our numbers have been roughly doubling every decade since 1990, is because the churches are losing a lot of their political power for reasons that I think have to do with them maybe not always being the most progressive. And people are saying, okay, what is out there that is more progressive and more in line with my conscience than the church I grew up in? And a lot of people are landing in pagan traditions.
Recently in like the maybe last 10 or 15 years, a lot of Catholic parishes are have closed, and is it from all that you have studied, is it from the economy more likely, or that people just don't have enough to donate, or has the situations that you described about how uh, the patriarchal side of the major religions might turn away some of the people. Would that account for a lot of parishes and Catholic schools closing? Do you have any opinion about that?
I really do. This is something that I've had a very close up view of as a former Catholic myself, and a number of the people I was raised with as my peers in the Catholic churches are also not Catholic anymore. And the reasons I would give, in order of importance, are homophobia, transphobia, sexism, and religious intolerance. There has been a mass exodus of millennials and Gen Z from the churches because a lot of churches are still preaching, we don't recognize gay couples and families with gay parents. We don't allow you to receive our sacraments if you're in a sexual relationship that is not a single lifelong heterosexual marriage. We don't recognize trans people and we don't think they know what they're talking about. And people of my age are en masse just refusing to tolerate that. And we're being told by the churches, well, we're not going to change. So if you don't agree with us, you have to leave. And that's what's happening. For the first time in history recently, we did reach a point where the majority of Americans did not self-identify, the majority of Americans under 40, excuse me, did not self-identify as Christian. And there's a very big age gap there, and I think it is related to the civil rights issues because the people who have spent most of their adult life being like, what do you mean? It's messed up to discriminate against gay people there are churches that are very gay friendly and gay accepting, and I am so happy with them that they exist. But the largest churches in America, by and large, are very, if you're going to tell people that they can't do or believe a lot of things and still be a member of you, you're going to lose a lot of members.
Mhm. So do those gay accepting churches, do they receive more attendance than other ones now? Or have you not been able to notice whether this is so or not?
Yeah, I don't know the
That's
statistics
okay.
about that off the top of my head. I know it's been very interesting to watch because there have been a number of churches that have actually had schisms over this, where some of their individual pastors and congregations have been like, I'm not okay with being homophobic, and others have been like, I'm not okay with accepting gay people. And you've actually ended up with two different branches of the church in America that have different opinions about that. So it's been really interesting to watch those happen.
Mhm. And as that was happening, how do you think was it paganism or maybe something else that affected it? And do you find that it is very necessary for people to actually have to worship something versus being non-denominational?
Yeah, so I don't, again, I don't know. I can't claim cause and effect. I don't think that paganism was influential enough to give it like primary credit for gay rights progressing, but it is easy to see how people who are believers in gay rights would feel very welcome in the pagan religions because the pagan religions historically do have, portrayals of divine homosexual relationships, of divine, um, transgendered and other gendered gods. There are a lot of people in my pagan congregation who are trans, and I think one reason for that is because there are portrayals of, and there's actually very interesting social history when you get into it. A lot of polytheistic religions historically have recognized more than two genders or have had entire procedures for legally changing your gender. That is not actually that new a thing, but it is something that hasn't been allowed to exist under patriarchy for the last few thousand years for reasons that I discuss in World Soul that are more really like economic and military than theological, but it infects the theology. And next thing you know, you have people with these beliefs that you have to be homophobic and transphobic in order to be religious. But that's not actually how it's been historically at all. I feel like there was a second question there. Oh yes, the need for worship. So worship is an interesting term for me because if you go by the definition that the Muslims and Christians usually use, worship is this act of like complete submission and obedience to where you're like, I'm going to surrender my free will, I'm going to obey you no matter what, all of these things. I don't think that's how pagans necessarily conceptualize worship. For me, it's being in relationship with someone. And if you're in relationship with a god, if you're showing gratitude to them, if you're giving them nice things, is that worship? Pagans usually do refer to it that way. But to me, it's not so much a specific need to like submit to a higher power. It's more of a need to just be in relationship with the beings that I can perceive around me. And if that's worship because I'm giving a deity nice things, then sure, there's a need for worship. But to me, it's all a subset of being in relationship with my fellow beings. You know.
Mhm. And for the Chinese people, a lot of them believe in that inanimate objects such as stones and trees uh, are actually have souls, or I don't know if it's their souls, but they are spirits. And then also there's the ancestral worship too of Chinese people. Would that be considered, would those beliefs be considered paganism?
So that is an excellent question. It's a very loaded question because I've heard a lot of this discussion. My personal policy is that if someone self-identifies as a pagan and they have these beliefs, then yes, I think they're a pagan. If they don't want to be identified as a pagan, I'm not going to tell them that they're a pagan. And that's been very controversial in recent years because the old Christian approach was that any religion that had animistic or polytheistic beliefs or just wasn't, Abrahamic was pagan. And sometimes even other Abrahamic faiths got thrown in there because intellectual rigor is not always a thing. But because the Christians went around telling everyone, hey, you're pagan and that's a bad thing, there are a lot of religions that really don't want to be called pagan now and do not mostly self identify as pagan. But even within those communities, there's not agreement. I've heard Hindus and African practitioners self-identify as pagan in their beliefs, and I've heard Hindus and African practitioners say, "No, we're not pagan at all. Don't call us that." So I try to respect how people want to be identified, but in the broad scheme of things, I think that if people who have those beliefs and practices want to be known as part of the pagan community, I do think we're very compatible.
And what is the difference between polytheistic religion and paganism? Are they one and both the same, or is if someone is polytheistic, they are not necessarily pagan?
So again, with my sensibility around self-identification, it's ask that person, do they want to be called pagan?
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, Historically, academics have used it as a thing where um, polytheism is like a subset of paganism, and that both polytheistic and animistic people who work with nature spirits but maybe don't work with gods could have considered to be pagan beliefs. But again, I'm all for self-identification. So I see this thing a lot on the ground where people compare practices and we're like, hey, our practices are really similar. If you want to hang out, let's do it.
And what about those that do believe in animal spirits and inanimate objects having spirits? Do they totally reject that there is a deity, or do some of them could care less one way or the other? They just believe in their in in animals and inanimate objects having spirits.
I do think that it's very much a false dichotomy to suggest that if you are an animist, you don't believe in even the Abrahamic God. There are a lot of of animists who actually do believe in the Abrahamic God, but then Abrahamic religious leaders might say to them, "Oh, you're not doing our theology right because we don't believe in that." But there are a lot of people who are animists and also even monotheists, and there are also people who are animists but don't believe in or don't like to work with gods as well.
Oh, if our listeners want to learn more about your book and about you, Catherine, where should they go?
Yeah, definitely. So the full title of the book, for our Zoom viewers, I will hold it up here, is World Soul: Healing Ourselves and the Earth Through Pagan Theology. It is I've been told a short book, but not a short read, because a lot of people have told me, I had to like stop and contemplate for a while after I finished every chapter. But it is designed to be a primer for the ways in which pagan theologies are different from what might popularly be thought of as Christianity or Islam, and the reasons that I think these theologies can be really helpful with the issues we're facing today, with the environmental destruction, with the mental health issues, with gender based violence. And that is available on Amazon. I am working on bookstores. Bookstore bureaucracy is a whole thing. But right now it's available on Amazon as both an ebook and a paperback. My website is Catherine with a C, Carr with two R's. So catherinecarr.org. I actually do have a new book that you can get a free ebook copy of through the website, and I'm also facilitating a series of free healing rituals throughout the year via Zoom. So if you go to catherinecarr.org, you can receive that book, which is a little bit more in the self help than in the theology space. It talks about some important concepts of consent, autonomy, boundaries, and also has preparation for the ritual that I facilitate. So if that's interesting to you, go sign up for my mailing list. I would love to have you with us.
Mhm. And for those rituals, what are we talking about?
Yeah.
Yeah, just explain a little bit more about those rituals.
Yeah, so one of the wonderful things about rituals in paganism is that you really can make them for the purpose that you need. A lot of the whole study of magic, which is something that there are books and books and books about, the whole study of pagan magic is how do you use different elements, different sensory elements, different materials to create the spiritual and magical effect that you want. For this ritual, it is a cord cutting, and it is to help people sever any bonds that they don't want to be bound by anymore. So anything in their life that they would like to get away from, that they would like to get rid of, that they would like to stop doing, we do a magical cord cutting to help people let go of those things and move on. And it is a little scary. Like I have a foot in both camps as far as like the atheo-pagan and the well, I am theistic, let's face it. I have a lot of relationships with gods, but um I tend to have a more skeptical take. But the people who have done this ritual, like very strong effects. The first time I did it, I stayed in touch with the cohort, and I think the year after the cord cutting, like half of them were living, and this happened to me the first time I did it too, were living in a different state, in a different romantic relationship, in a different career. So I'm like, it moves you, it does. So that's something that I try to offer because I did the ritual for the first time because I needed help changing things in my life, and boy, did that work. I was a clinical research coordinator in a different state, in a different community 8 years ago. So
Have you ever, just since you mentioned that, have you ever delved into the rituals, maybe the ingredients or the sounds that you are making? Maybe they do correspond somehow in science to what you're trying to uh, create, and
yeah.
maybe it is there's more, there maybe it's magic and maybe there's a science happening as well when a ritual is successful, either partially or totally.
Yeah, there are a lot of things where we do know now that, having a candle lit, the pattern of the light that the candle produces does have a certain neurological effect.
Mhm.
That a lot of the herbs that are used in pagan magic actually do have demonstrated effects on the emotions and the nervous system through the scent receptors and the chemicals that they carry. So there actually is a lot of science that there actually is a science to this. And then there's a debate about is to what extent is the magical thing a separate thing where there is like a metaphysical magical separate effect. And I'm kind of inclined to say that there is, but like even if there isn't, it's still a very powerful thing to do. There's another book called How God Works that is very good. I believe it's by, let me look this up before I say it. But this How God Works book is a book by a psychologist, yes, David DeSteno, who studied a bunch of rituals from a bunch of different religions just to see like what is the objective effect that these rituals have. And they were like, okay, folks, these religions really kind of know what they're doing because these different elements that they're using actually do produce measurable behavioral effects that are pretty powerful. So that's another great book.
Okay, awesome. Oh, well, Catherine Carr, thank you so much for joining us on WZRD Chicago 88.3 FM today and discussing uh, paganism and also your volume, World. So when was it published?
It was published this summer, this July. So it's been out for a few months, but I was at Parliament World Religions at the time, so
Mhm.
I'm getting on the marketing more now.
Okay. And do you have any book signings coming up shortly?
I do not have any signings scheduled. That is in the works.
Okay.
If you join my mailing list, you will definitely hear about that. There will be at least a couple of signings around Chicago.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Catherine. And congratulations on the book, and we'll talk again soon.
Thank you. It's been great to talk to you.